Daniel, if you thought you're famous, now you'll be even more famous.
If we're talking about famous, has everybody viewed the video of Women in Theory?
Oh, that's
Probably not
something.
enough times.
That doesn't help, Tal, because viewing from the same machine doesn't help. Believe me, if it would have, we'd already be at 1 million views because I watched it at least 500,000 times.
Okay, everyone, please behave. This applies to the panelists as well. You're now on, I wanted to say national television, but it's actually international television. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the second and last invited talk of this conference. It's given by Alon Rosen. Alon got his PhD from the Weizmann Institute under the supervision of Oded Goldreich and Moni Naor, who is here in the panel. He then did his postdoc at MIT and Harvard, and then he joined IDC Herzliya, where he founded the successful fact center that attracted and still attracts many international visitors and interns. Alon is well known for many fundamental contributions in the field of cryptography, mainly in the theory side, such as zero-knowledge proofs, concurrency and non-malleability, chosen ciphertext security, pseudo-random functions, pioneering works in lattice-based cryptography, for which he was recognized by the TCC Test of Time Award, and establishing influential new connections between cryptography and other fields, such as game theory and fine-grained complexity. And even though I just said that Alon is part of the theory community, even chaired the TCC conference recently, unlike most people in this community, Alon also ventures into really practical applications of cryptography. And this includes a voting system that was actually deployed in the primaries of a major party in Israel. Is it fair to call it a major party, Alon?
Not anymore.
Okay. And also, involved in the development of a practical lattice-based hash function, Swift hash function, which took part in the NIST competition. So it's very unusual for someone whose research is as theory-oriented. On a more personal level, Alon is known as a charismatic and inspirational figure to many. He can distill complex ideas by easily digestible catchphrases, such as real cryptographers don't use obfuscation, but he's also very pragmatic. The next thing he does is co-author an influential paper basing hardness of Nash equilibrium on obfuscation. But then he sticks to his principles and shows that in fact one can get rid of obfuscation in the same context. But who knows, if this is the end, the last chapter in Alon's love-hate relationship with obfuscation. In any case, so now Alon will go on the other extreme from the high end of obfuscation. He will talk about the low end of basing cryptography on more conservative or different assumptions. And without further ado, let me allow Alon to speak. Thanks, Alon.
Thanks, Yuval, for the amazing introduction. I wouldn't believe it myself. Now that you mentioned the voting system, actually, I regret not having had prepared a talk about that. It would have been much more amusing than what I'm going to talk about. So, okay, so let me share the screen. Can you see something? My screen, for instance?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Good, so I'm going back. So the title of the talk is Fine-Grained Cryptography, a New Frontier, ? I would like to start by thanking the Eurocrypt 2020 PC for inviting me to speak. I would like to thank my 3 young and wonderful co-authors for the works on fine-grained crypto, Marshall Ball, Manuel Sabin, and Prashant Vasudevan, also known as the 3 Sun Musketeers. They are representative of a amazing young generation that we have in the crypto community. They're smart, they're curious, they're honest, intellectually honest, and have amazing taste. As a representative of my own generation, I'd like to thank Andrei Bogdanov, which is a very smart person. I would say he's too wise, but to not make it sound as an insult, I will call him almost too wise. And finally, I'd like to thank Moni Naor, especially in the context of fine-grained cryptography. Moni always maintained the opinion that crypto is special in that it evolves very quickly. So you have to be all the time alert to developments and keep studying the most recent results and concepts. So continuing the analogy to fencing, I would call him en garde because you have to be alert. But if you think about it a bit more, then a more appropriate name for Moni is avant-garde, as many of you already know. Okay, so I'm going to talk about fine-grained crypto, and fine-grained crypto is a very strange thing to talk about because if you believe that exponentially hard crypto is possible, then there's no point in fine-grained crypto because it in particular implies it. And we do believe that exponentially hard crypto exists, and the only context in which I really can think fine-grained crypto can be relevant is that of public key encryption. So let me give you a bit of context that you all know. This is the timeline of public key encryption. It all starts with a paper by Merkle using a random oracle to establish a key exchange. The paper is titled Secure Communications Over Insecure Channels. I found it amusing swapping the order of secure and insecure in the title. The main drawback of Merkle's key exchange is that it's secure only against quadratic time adversaries. And this is a quote from the paper. This paper has thus far dealt with a method which is order of n squared. If an exponential method were possible, it would offer such significant advantages over traditional techniques that it would almost surely supplant them in short order. Now, I don't know, this paper was submitted in 75, and I don't know if this paragraph was written in hindsight or not. In 78, when the paper was accepted to CACM, he added at the end of the paper this addendum. Diffie and Hellman has published a paper which gives a broad overview of the new class of cryptographic problems. Vivest, Shamir, and Edelman have also proposed a public key crypto system. Further research is in progress, and the results have been extremely encouraging. And you know, the rest is history. We have a super polynomial security and public key encryption. And we have the two main threads. We have the number theoretic thread of public key encryption and what one would call the noisy linear algebra thread. And perhaps a few other outliers based on combinatorial problems. And based on this, we have seen in the last 4.5 decades things that Merkle, I would suppose, could have not imagined: two-party computation and multi-party computation, fully homomorphic encryption, functional encryption, ABE, obfuscation, and all these advanced notions that are building on some of these assumptions on which the public key encryption relies. And at the risk of saying too many cliches in one sentence, I would say that we're flying quite close to the sun with all our advanced notions, especially given that we are on thin ice in terms of the assumptions on which public key encryption is based. And my point is that we do have amazing public key encryption, and it's not that I doubt that it's secure or anything like that, but we do face the risk of having it erased from the earth or extinguished in a mass extinction event, and we must widen the basis on which public key encryption is based. And this is based only on the sheer small number of candidates that we have. I really think that one cannot argue that we don't have many candidates. And maybe it's not a coincidence that we don't have many candidates. Maybe it's not really easy to obtain them. And what I want to suggest in this talk, and I don't think you should take this too seriously as motivation for the talk, but still, I would like to focus on the following question. What if we went back to fixed poly security? In the context, in specific concept of public key encryption, because there, having fixed poly security does make sense, given that public key encryption is so scarce. And the reason I'm saying it is because in the past decade or 15 years even, we have we've had these amazing developments in a field called fine-grained complexity and also related developments in crypto. And fine-grained complexity, I can summarize it as follows. It postulates that the best node algorithm for some well-studied problems that can be solved in polynomial time, are optimal, and not necessarily ones that are solved in polynomial time. So this is what we do in this talk. So keep that in mind, even though I can say honestly at the outset that I don't know how to build new public key encryptions based on fine-grained complexity. It is just my sense that things are brewing there, and the recent developments might indicate that there's something to look at. Okay, so let's start with defining fine-grained crypto and talk a bit about democratic republics. So what is fine-grained crypto? In simple terms, the honest part is run in time n to the c for some fixed c. For simplicity, you could think of c equals 1, like the honest part is run in linear time. And the adversary is allowed to run in times n to the d. Traditionally, in cryptography, we take any d greater than c. This is theoretical cryptography. Of course, we could take the adversary to allow him to run even in super polynomial time. But just to contrast it to fine-grained crypto, let's talk about this. And the distinction with fine-grained crypto is that in fine-grained crypto, we talk about some fixed d greater than c. As I said, if you're traditionally secure, then you're also fine-grained secure. So what is the point of all of this exercise? The point is that in principle, we could base fine-grained crypto on fixed polynomial rather than super polynomial hardness. So here's the question I'd like you to have in the back of your mind during the talk. Can we get new public key encryptions, assuming fixed worst case hardness polynomial time solvable problems? And in particular, let's say secure against n to the 6th time adversaries. So what I would like you to come out of this talk with is the following message, that this is not merely scaling down crypto the way that we know it. There's something going on in fine-grained crypto in recent years that is different than what has been going on higher in the hierarchy of problems. So one thing that is a semi-distinction is that we have worst case to average case reduction. This is the case also for some traditional public key encryptions, of course. But what is not typical is that the worst case assumptions relate to non-trivial speedups of SAT, and we'll be talking about this extensively today. And this is something very strong, very impressive. Another thing that I'd like to point out that is very distinctive to fine-grained crypto is that there are many new problems to work with, and the scarcity of problems to work with is exactly what inhibits development of new crypto systems, public key crypto systems. And these problems are structured and interrelated, which is a very good thing if you want to establish the relative hardness of this problem and build your building and your scaffolding based on these relations. So this is essentially the message. If you quit listening at this point, I've done my share in the talk. Okay, so I'd like to point out at this point, at this moment in time, a nice paper, very nice paper from Crypto 19 titled Public Key Crypto in the Fine-Grained Settings, where Rio Lavigne, Andrea Lincoln, and Virginia Vasilevska Williams put forward this question and tackled it directly. It's a very nice paper. I recommend reading it. They don't quite achieve my dream, but they do a very interesting first step, and we'll talk about it later. And I think more papers like this should come out of our community and neighboring communities. Okay, now the connection to democratic republics. You might ask yourself, what's the connection? So I always told my kids that if a country has the words democratic republic in its name, there's one thing you can know for sure, that the country is not democratic and it's not a republic. The same thing applies to titles of invited talks. So when you talk about, when you declare at the outset that it's a new frontier, one thing you can know for sure. So we know that fine-grained crypto started with Merkle. In fact, it started before Merkle with the password hatching in the Unix system. In the 80s, we've had low-end attempts at one-way permutation and pseudo-random generator. When I say low-end, it's based on easy problems in P, for which we do have actually unconditional lower bounds. Of course, cryptanalysis could be thought of as engaging in activities that are related to the fine-grained setting. Proofs of work require no introduction. In the early 90s, Bellare, Rogaway, Kilian talked about tight and concrete reductions, and the craft of tight reduction is closely related to what you actually do when you study fine-grained complexity. Time locks and commitments, also in the 90s and also more recently. We've had recent works and also in the 90s about depth-bounded and narrowly bounded adversary, would also be interpreted as some fine-grained treatment of adversarial behavior. And recently we've had some nice work that mirrors the low-end work from the 80s in the context of public key encryption, fully homomorphic encryption, and verifiable computation. I will talk about none of this stuff. If you want to know more, there's been a talk, invited talk by Moni, and a companion paper published in 2003 titled Moderately Hard Function from Complexity to Span Fighting, where amongst other things, he challenges the community to develop a theory for a moderate hardness. The community has not risen to the occasion yet, and I take the opportunity to call the community to do it again, to try to do it again. Okay, so back to our context. Merkle key exchange, 1974. It's a key exchange between Alice and Bob. Both Alice and Bob each make n calls to a random oracle, and Merkle proves that in the random oracle model, any adversary that makes little o of n squared queries to the random oracle cannot break it. Biam, Goren, and Isha in 2008 replaced the random oracle with the assumption that the parties have access to an exponentially hard one-way function. And this is quite remarkable, actually, because you have a public key primitive, public key encryption primitive that is based on symmetric key. And this could guarantee very strong security, provided that you have a higher gap. Almost 20 years later, after Merkle, Impagliazzo and Rudich showed that any such protocol can be broken by O tilde of n to the 6 queries. And their motivation was different, but it's actually a cryptanalytic result in spirit. It shows how no matter how you build the protocol, given access to a random oracle, you can find the correlations between Alice's Bob using O to the order n to the 6 queries. And this result is famous as being interpreted as an impossibility result of building a public key crypto from a private key crypto. So no black box construction of public key encryption from one-way functions exists. This is because the random oracle is in particular a one-way function. And by breaking the protocol with the polynomial number of queries, you show that in a relative world with this oracle, you have one-way functions, but you don't have key exchange. Now, this already shatters the hope of building super polynomial time-secure crypto from random oracles, but it left open the important question, actually, of building something that cannot be broken in time n to the 5th, say. And these hopes were dashed by Barak and Mahmoudi in 2008, who showed how to strengthen and tighten the Impagliazzo-Rudich result to order n squared queries. In other words, Merkel's result is tight as far as black box reductions go. Now, this result is theoretical, but actually, if you think about it, it has some practical motivation. If you compare the security that you get, this is logarithmic scale that compares n squared and n to the 6th. If you compare the graph of 2 log n to get to 6 log n, to get 80 bits of security, the parties have to work a lot, 2 to the 40. But as soon as you go down to 2 to the 25 and stick to 6 log n, you get 100 bits of security. Here, of course, I'm ignoring constants, and of course, I'm ignoring all issues that are incurred by fixing a well-specified model of computation, but it gives you an idea of how secure you could get with a polynomial as modest as n to the 6th, let alone a higher degree polynomial. So there could be even some practical merit to developing a fine-grained crypto, especially if no alternative is available, but not only in that case. Okay, so the natural question that is motivating all of this study, on part of it, is whether we can break the order n squared barrier, and this clearly will require a non-black box technique. And the lucky thing is that we're talking about assumptions and problems that lie within P. And P is precisely the set of structured problems whose structure can be exploited to do interesting things, as otherwise they would have not been in P. And this is actually a good thing. You know, structures is perceived as a disadvantage in crypto, but I want to point out that it's not always a disadvantage, as you know. In particular, we can use structure for efficient implementation. We've been doing that a lot in the last 40 years. Another thing is that it automatically enables us to bypass non-black box results. And sometimes even get unconditional lower bounds. The only unconditional lower bounds that we have are there precisely because of the structure of the problems. And most importantly, using structure is not unprecedented. It's not like we haven't done this before. And I want to stress the distinction here between non-black box results in simulations, say in zero knowledge or in protocol, and non-black box result in the context of computational problems. The latter are much easier to handle. You're handling problems the way we are used to handle them, algorithmically, typically. Whereas dealing with simulation, you deal with machines that we don't really understand. We don't know how to reverse engineer and to understand. Okay, moving to the next part of the talk, the structure in general, the plan and the dream. Okay, so another high-level view of structure in crypto. So crypto necessitates that P is not equal to NP. Of course, we would have loved to base crypto on a problem like satisfiability. It would be a universal problem. If anything is secure, then SAT would be secure, but we know that it's not going to be easy. We have reason to believe why it's not going to be easy. So we settle for problems that are lower than the set NP complete. And in symmetric crypto, one can characterize the problem as being very unstructured and abundant. You take any sufficiently complex process and iterate it sufficiently many times, you're likely to get something secure. Of course, it's not that simple because you have a tension between the number of times you iterate and so on. But it's conjectured that if you iterate even a very simple local permutation in enough times, you'll get a secure block size, local random permutation. And I think I dare to say that cryptographers are quite confident in the security of such a construct. There's a recent nicely titled paper by Jean-Philippe Onasson called Too Much Crypto, where he suggests to reduce the number of rounds in hash functions, and then even in AES, arguing that given how they have survived attack recently, it might be safe to even reduce the number of rounds. And reducing the number of rounds and tightening the size of the circuits will have implications later on the reductions that we do. Now we go to public key encryption. There, the assumptions are more structured and are more scarce, and they lie in NP intersect NP. I've said enough about public key crypto scarcity. I'll just point two wonderful surveys by Boad Barak. One is the complexity of public key cryptography, and one is structure versus combinatorics and computational complexity. You can find there a very intelligent and thorough discussion of the matter. What I'm advocating here is that perhaps if we're going for structure, we might as well go all the way and enter the class P. And I suggest to focus on problem within P. Fine-grained complexity shows that there are connections, tight connections between problems there. We'll discuss some of them. And they are plentiful. Now, before you jump, you cryptanalysts jump and claim that these problems are too easy, and hence you can write a paper titled Too Little Crypto. I want to mention that we already know that some of these problems, if you get even a moderate speed up to their solution, you can speed up exhaustive search on the worst case of SAT. Okay, so it will come bite you in the ass, like one could say. So you have to be careful when you claim that these problems are too easy. And this connection is actually one of the interesting connections that we uncovered recently, and that makes me optimistic about the endeavor. Okay, so what's the plan? We want problems that are average case hard with complexity n square and cube and so on. We want to identify them, the candidate hard problem. We want to justify the worst case hardness because it's much safer to assume worst case hardness than average case hardness. We want to reduce an average case problem. And later on, once we get this average case problem, we hope that it's structured and we can utilize its structure to get interesting crypto. And this is the focus of this talk. This is what I'm going to show you in the rest of this talk. The dream is to push these ideas further to get new fine-grained public key encryption. And even before that, maybe a structured one-way function would do. I emphasize the word structured here because, if you believe that symmetric block ciphers have exponential hardness, then you automatically get a non-structured one-way function. My hope in building a structured one-way function, and I know that is an ill-defined problem, is that the techniques that we use to establish and to build such functions will enable us to push further into public key encryption. Sorry, I jumped. And I want to mention again this paper by Lavigne, Lincoln, and Williams that already tackles this problem. They built a fine-grained public key encryption based on average case hardness and one that does not beat the quadratic gap given by Merkle yet. Okay, so this is how it looks pictorially. You have this axis, the y-axis. You have the increases complexity of the problems. And what we want to find is to fill these circles with problems that have increasing complexity. What we'll do later, we'll reduce k-sat, the exponential hardness of k-sat to these problems. These are all worst case problems. Then we'll reduce each one of these problems to a corresponding average case hard problem, and then we'll use the structure of the average case hard problem to build proofs of work, which is non-trivial, interesting crypto. Again, it can be built by exponentially hard block ciphers in practice, and yet it possesses some structure that might be exploited down the line. Okay, so what is the problem that I'm going to use to demonstrate this approach? This is a problem called orthogonal vectors, introduced by Hopcroft in the 80s and very prominent in computational geometry and data structures. It's a quite simple problem. The input is two tall and thin matrices, U and V. Each row of the matrix is a binary vector. The number of rows is indexed by n, and the columns d. Think of d as being polylogarithmic in n. And the decision question is whether there exists a U and V that are orthogonal over the integers, or that you could state it as the set indicated by the vectors are disjoint, by the vectors U and V are disjoint. And of course, this problem also has a counting version where you want to count the number of U's and V's that are orthogonal. Now, this problem, of course, you can solve it in quadratic complexity, but it turns out that we don't know to do much better. The best algorithm from 2015 takes time n squared minus something that vanishes with the log of d over log n. So this leads us to a conjecture. It's called the orthogonal vectors conjecture. So if d is super logarithmic in n, meaning that this thing approaches 2 asymptotically, OV takes 2 to the n to the 2 minus little o of 1 time. Okay, this is a nice conjecture. Turns out this is a central conjecture in the world of fine-grained complexity. But why should we believe in this conjecture? And the reason we should believe in this conjecture is because we can reduce the hardness of worst case SAT to it. So we have a k-sat formula. So you have n variables and the conjunction of clauses, each of with k, which has k literals. The best known worst case algorithm for this problem is approaches 2 to the n as k grows. So it's 2 to the 1 minus theta 1 over k times n. So the larger you take k, the closer you get to 2 to the n, which leads to the strong exponential time hypothesis by Pagliazzo, Paturi, and Zane, which postulates that for every epsilon, every constant epsilon, there exists a large enough k so that k sat takes 2 to the 1 minus epsilon n time. Using this conjecture, we can actually show worst case hardness of a more general problem, which is called K of V. It's just a generalization of the two matrix problem we had before. You have k matrices, And you want to find matching vectors that indicate disjoint sets. I just want to emphasize here for clarity that it's not the same K. It's just a sad artifact of historical circumstances that the same K is used in both names. And the KOV conjecture is that if D equals omega of log n, just as before, solving KOV takes n to the K minus little of 1 time. And this is implied by the strong exponential time hypothesis that we have here. So if you could speed up KOV beyond the K to n to the K minus little of 1, you can speed up the solution of K sat. Okay, so how do you get average case hardness from these worst case problems? So before we get to that, I'd like to make a short survey of known worst case to average case reduction in the complexity world. Of course, we have in crypto and in number theory, in crypto lattices and number theory, you have problems that have worst case to average case reduction. There are different flavors. I will not get into these resolutions, and these are the ones that we are familiar with. At the low end, we have worst case to average case reductions for parity or matrix multiplication. These are mostly used in the context of, say, program testing or in low end fine-grained crypto. They're not very useful cryptographically. At the high end, we have multilinear extensions and permanent, which have worst case to average case reductions. Again, they're not useful for crypto because they have exponentially many terms. There's no efficiency there. We have a recent result that is very interesting by Hirahara, showing problems, worst case average case reduction to problems that are not known to be in co-NP, which is somewhat surprising. I will not deal with these problems here. What I'll deal with is problems in P, what I call mid-range, moderately hard problems, and I want unconditional worst case to average case reduction. What we do know is that if you assume strong assumptions like circular secure FHE, you could get worst case to average case reduction for any polynomial n to the c, with problems with any polynomial hardness n to the c in P, which of course gives indication that there's hope for this result, if you're willing to assume the circular secure FHE. Okay, so this is what we have so far. This is what we want to build now. We want to build an average case problem. One problem that one may consider is just sampling random OV instances, taking ones and zeros with some fixed probabilities, P and 1 minus P. Turns out that this is not a very good candidate, at least on the face of it. It can be solved in sub-quadratic time. So what we'll have to do, and this is what we suggested in 2017, is to consider a different problem. It's a polynomial that gets these U and V as inputs and is hard to compute for random U and V. We call it FOV. And just to get used to the ideas, you should think of it as a symbolic polynomial like the permanent, that is a polynomial in the entries of the matrix you're computing the permanent of. And the permanent is known to have these kind of reductions, and it's no coincidence. Okay, so let me describe the polynomial. This is the central result today. So you're given U and V. This time, think of U and V as not necessarily being binary, but belonging to some small finite field, the entries of U and V. And consider the following product of D terms: 1 minus UI1 Vj1 times 1 minus UI2 Vj2, and so on. This is for every pair of rows I and j in the U and V respectively. And the property of this product is that for binary Ui and Vj, this product is 1 if and only if the vectors are orthogonal. So now all you need to do in order to express the orthogonal vector problems casted within this polynomial is to sum over all pairs I and j from 1 to n. So it's a polynomial that has quadratically many terms. It has a degree 2d, and it gets 2 nd inputs and outputs 1 field elements. And recall that d can be taken to be some small polylog function of n. So to summarize, we have a polynomial with n squared terms. It computes for every term whether a pair UIVJ is orthogonal, and by summing up, you're effectively counting them. This is the reason why I require P to be greater than n squared, so that in case you're counting, you don't have a wraparound, a modulo the characteristic of the field. Two properties to keep in mind is that F is computable in quadratic time, which is very tight with the conjecture, the hardness of computing this polynomial on the average, and that on binary inputs, not on general field elements, but on binary inputs, it counts the number of orthogonal UIVJ pairs. And we have a worst case to average case reduction. If orthogonal vectors takes quadratic time in the worst case, then computing F on a random input, which a random input is simply two random matrices of appropriate dimension of field elements, it takes the same time on the average. So this is the statement, and this is the worst case to average case reduction. The proof is built on works from the late 80s, early 90s, Beaver Feigenbaum, Lipton, and Gemel Sudan, developed in slightly different context back then, and it observes, the main observation is that the reduction is really efficient. The worst case to average case reduction, the original one, is really efficient. So I'm going, due to shortage of time, I'm going to skip the proof for now. If we'll have time at the end, we'll get to it. The main idea is that you can invoke an average case solver on an error correcting code that is on a structured set of points. And even if the oracle, the average case oracle is faulty, as an average case oracle is, you can still correct to any input. The only thing I want to observe here is that you have three stages to this procedure. One is to prepare the inputs to which you feed to A. This will take, you need order D inputs, and each one of them will take n times this time to prepare. Invoking A D times takes order D times T, where T is the running time of A. And the error correction takes order D cubed with standard error corrections. This is because the degree of the polynomial you'll be error correcting is D. And remember that this is polylogarithmic, and the conclusion from all of this careful bookkeeping is that if the algorithm A runs in times that is n to the 1 plus alpha for some constant, then B will run in essentially the same time. So the reduction introduced very little overhead relative to the original running time of A. And this is how you can conclude that if A solves in subquadratic time, evaluates the polynomial subquadratic time, then B solves in the worst case orthogonal vectors in subquadratic time, thus violating the orthogonal vectors conjecture. Two things I want to point out. This argument can be enhanced to also handle a vanishing probability of error. So we can handle an A that succeeds with probability as little as 1 over n to the little of 1. And the reason I'm pointing it out, because to establish this result, you need to use the structure of the polynomial f, and in particular, the fact that it's downward self-reducible. So this is one place where structure is being used in a very strong manner. And I apologize to those of you in the audience that ask questions. I just have so much to tell you in so little time. I cannot even pause. Maybe we'll get back later to this. Okay, so what's the situation right now? We have a reduction from the strong exponential time hypothesis. Yuval, maybe you can promote Daniel Witz. He seems to insist to have a question, and he always has good questions, so might be worth promoting him. And while you do it, I'll keep on speaking. So we have this reduction, worst case to worst case. Then we have worst case to average case. And I just want to point out that this reduction that I sort of hand waved at you in the previous slides applies also to any constant dimension K of V. And so we get a hierarchy of worst case to average case reduction. Just for completeness, this is how the polynomial looks when you have K K matrices U1 to UK. It's just the sum over I1 to IK of the products for Ls in D of these products of the entries. Okay, I see that nobody's asking questions, so I'll continue. The next step is to see how to get from these average case problems a proof of work. So proofs of work. Introduced by Drucker in 92. I think the name proofs of work was coined by Jules and Jacobson in 99. And the idea is to quickly make sure that the party expanded the T of n work. By quickly, I mean significantly faster than doing the work yourself. So you have on the left, you have a solver. On the right, you have a challenger. The challenger challenges with some randomly selected challenge C. Of course, selected the challenge should be a quick process. And then the solver sends the solution. What we want is that coming up with a solution takes time T of n, and verifying takes, let's say, times n, which is presumably smaller than T of n. And what we observed in our work, and this followed from previous work by Williams, is that the proof system for the polynomial fk of v, the polynomial that we just saw in the previous slide, implies a proof of work from the hardness, the average case hardness of fk of v. So the point is that f of v can be quickly certified, much faster than evaluated, and this is thanks to an MA proof system for the polynomial f of v by Williams. Williams actually 1 year before us came up with the same polynomial for a totally different reason, and of course independently. He wanted to refute a non-deterministic version of the strong exponential time hypothesis, and he did so by showing short refutations in a probabilistic model. It's called an MA proof system. It's a probabilistic variant of NP certificates. So I will not describe this proof system, I'll just discuss it at a high level. In this proof system, already cast in the language of proofs of work, the verifier picks a random input to the polynomial f of v. It's 2 ND elements. Think of it as the 2 matrices of field elements, and challenges the prover with them, u1 and u2. The prover then computes the value of the polynomial, and along with it, he computes a proof certifying that y is indeed the value of f of x. And naturally, this takes a quadratic time, assuming the orthogonal vectors conjecture, because we know by now that if the orthogonal vector conjecture is true, then computing y from x takes a quadratic time. The work involved here is some setup work, interpolating a specially structured polynomial where the variables are the indices of the columns of u1 and u2, and then interpolating this polynomial. The polynomial has degree, I think, 2nd, and he sends along the proof and the polynomial. Actually, if you look carefully at this proof, you don't need to send y, it's implicit inside the proof pi. And then the verifier tosses some coins using Schwartz-Zippel to verify that indeed the proof certifies that f of x equals y. And this takes time O tilde of n, and an interesting property is that the verifier here uses a batch evaluation of univariate polynomials, or in other words, a fast Fourier transform for the appropriate finite field. And the soundness property is also very interesting. It's based on the following statement: the probability that the prover can run in time n to the 2 minus some epsilon, and the prover can choose this epsilon and convince b, is smaller than 1 over n to the epsilon over 2. So the less time the prover runs, the more bounded away his running time is from n squared, the lower his probability of success is, which is an interesting property that you don't necessarily have expected it to follow automatically. Again, something that is an artifact of the structure of the problem. Okay, one last property that is required from proof of work is that you cannot batch or amortize many challenges and solve them much faster than you would have solved each challenge independently. Or in other words, solving challenges C1 up to C of L requires times L times the time to solve, requires to solve a single challenge. This is something that is easily proved for random oracle-based proof of works, but here you would have expected that you can batch actually, because we're talking about low-degree polynomials. And what we show, and this is perhaps surprising, we show in a follow-up paper is that if OV takes n squared time on a single input, which is the OV conjecture, then on L inputs, let's say t squared inputs, F takes t times n squared, meaning that you cannot batch evaluate the polynomial f of v on a random input unless you have a way to speed up the worst case solution of OV. And I will not show you the proof, but again, this proof uses a downward self-reducibility and the worst case average case reduction combined. And the only thing I want to point out here that should be pointed out is that univariate polynomial can be batch evaluated, whereas here you have an example of a polynomial that cannot be batch evaluated, assuming OV is hard in the worst case for quadratic algorithms. And I want to mention that this applies also to KOV and to the K hardness. Now, what I didn't tell you, and this is the last thing I'm going to tell you about proofs of work, is that you can also certify KOV, FKOV, not just OV. The original Williams protocol certifies only the quadratic version. And inspired by Goldreich and Rotblum, which had a doubly efficient interactive proof, sum check-like proof for the K-click problem, K-click counting problem, we came up with a sum check-like proof system for FKOV. I'll just give you the structure of the proof system. Again, the verifier picks a random inputs. It looks like this. And then the prover and verifier engage in K rounds of interaction, at the end of which the verifier verifies using the transcript that f of x indeed equals y. And again, assuming that FKOV takes n to the k time, so does the proof of so that the time required by the prover. And again, we can prove that it is non-amortizable. To make this non-interactive and fit into the framework of proofs of work, you can collapse the protocol to be non-interactive using the Fiat-Shamir transformation. So here's the picture we have right now. We have the hierarchy of problems. We have polynomials for which one of the problems, and we have proofs of work for all hardness. You can tune the hardness according to the hardness that you want. And again, all of these, except the bottom one, can be made non-interactive via Fiat-Shamir. A nice feature of our proofs of work is that they are unique. This is not the case for the hash function-based proof of work, where you could have a lottery that gives a different solutions independently. Another interesting property is that KOV is sort of complete for all first-order graph properties, which is some intermediate set of problems that lies between the strong exponential time hypothesis and OV. It was used by GNI to show that a sort of a complexity completeness flavor within the fine-grained world. And we found this fact intriguing, and we thought that maybe our proofs of work could be in principle used to delegate work that is useful. In particular, maybe you're interested in solving one of these properties in the worst case on some graphs. Then you would apply our sequence of reduction, generate challenges that are provably hard to solve, and the solution is useful actually because you could use this solution to translate back to a solution to original problem. So we thought this is a very appealing property of the proofs of work that is not satisfied by SHA-256 based proofs of work, and we thought you could get a win-win proposition here. But it turns out that it's very hard to formulate what is meant for a proof to be useful, and I can admit that we don't have a satisfactory definition, and I think it's a good challenge to define what does it mean to be a proof of useful work in a context similar to this. I refer you to the paper for a discussion. You can find it on ePrint. It's titled Proofs of Useful Work. Okay, towards the end of the talk, I want to give you a flavor of how rich the fine-grained complexity world is. So far we've been discussing this K of V problem and the corresponding polynomials. Let me just browse quickly through other problems for which we know that we have worst case to average case reduction. For instance, 3-sum has a correspondence polynomial F3-sum, low degree polynomial gives a worst case to average case reduction. Again, corresponding proof of work. 3-sum in the fine-grained world is reducible to a problem called zero-weight triangle, which is an interesting hub problem. Again, it has a polynomial, it has a proof of work. All pairs shortest path is conjectured to take cubic time, reducible to zero-weight triangle. Zero-weight triangle is reducible to a problem called triangle collection, which is itself at least as hard as a strong exponential time hypothesis. Again, you can get a polynomial, average case polynomial and proof of work, and you get many, many polynomials from worst case hardness. So you have worst case hardness, average case hardness, and what I would call non-trivial crypto. Not quite public key encryption, but I think it's a start. Rothblum went further and gave a general characterization of the kind of worst case problems for which you can expect these type of worst case to average case problems. And these are called, they call them locally characterizable sets, and they define a complexity class based on this characterization and show worst case to average case reduction from problems in this class to problems to these polynomial problems. And interesting also, they show a reduction back to a problem within this class. It will be interesting in a moment. Other problems that are interesting and that are actually familiar to the cryptographers amongst us, K-sum, which can be thought of as a downscaled version of subset sum. In its worst case, it could in principle be conjectured to take time n to the k/2 rounded up. So for instance, 3-sums could take time n squared, 6-sum n cubed, 8-sum n4, 200-sum n to the 100. Again, I told you, they have worst case to average case reduction. Why do I mention K-sum? Because for subset sum, average case subset sum, we know by Lubashevsky, Palacio, and Segev that you can construct a public key encryption from the average case hardness of subset sum. So we have a mechanism for transforming average case hardness of subset sum to public key encryption. This could lead us to something, even though we already have exponentially hard public key encryption based on subset sum like problems. But I think the techniques there could be relevant. One interesting thing to point out about K-sum is that it's unlikely to be implied by the strong exponential time hypothesis. And interestingly, this work is what led the Williams to refute the non-deterministic strong exponential time hypothesis, which led to our proofs of work. Another interesting problem is K-click. K-click, the search version, is conjectured to take n to the omega k divided by 3, where omega is the matrix multiplication exponent, somewhere between 2 and 3. So this is slightly, this is small, a constant times k, constant smaller than 1 times k. Again, Goldreich-Rothblum showed a polynomial fk click, and interestingly, they showed a reduction back to some distribution on k-click problems, k-click counting problems. So now we have the following phenomenon, which starts being really interesting. We have a distribution D on graphs, so that counting the number of k-clicks in any graph reduces to counting k-clicks on this on graph sampled from this distribution. This is a property that was not known before, some sort of equivalence. I want in this context to point out a very recent paper by Bois, Alderas, Brennan, and Bressler, who showed a related result for the distribution GNP, which arguably is a very natural distribution, GNP on hypergraphs. There are many qualifiers to this result, but I think it's very interesting and something is happening there. It's becoming interesting, more increasingly interesting. I should mention that Appelbaum, Barak, and Vigdorson gave us a candidate public key encryption scheme based on the hidden or planted click problems in unbalanced bipartite graphs. And that could give us a hint that something might be doable in these more general contexts. So these are all hints. These are all hints about where one could possibly go, but definitely not the only one. Definitely not the only ones. I want to point out another result: a reduction from SAT to county K clicks. A very interesting result in the parameterized complexity. And what's interesting about it is that it reduces not from the strong exponential time hypothesis, but rather from the exponential time hypothesis, which is a weaker hypothesis. It postulates that there exists a constant, so the 3 SAT takes 2 to the constant alpha, so that the 3 SAT takes 2 to the alpha n time. This is a weaker hypothesis. This is something that is implied directly by the existence of very efficient, exponentially hard block ciphers, for instance. If you reduce them from circuit SAT to SAT, this is something you get automatically, and it's interesting. Now, last and not least is the Lavigne, Lincoln, and Williams result. It takes a problem called 0K click, which is some sort of a polychromatic problem on finding K clicks in graphs with the K sets, the disjoint sets of vertices. It's an average case problem. They are able to show a public key encryption scheme similar to Merkle key exchange that is n to the 1.5 minus epsilon secure, perhaps even n squared minus epsilon secure. I haven't found it in the full version of the paper. This is still, I remind you, this is still not more secure than Merkle, but it's definitely a start. And in particular, they use structure. They list 3 sufficient conditions for a problem to enable such key exchange, and they show that 0K click satisfy this condition. And I think this is a very interesting paper in this line of work. Worst case, average case, and public key encryption. This is the dream. Okay, so now it's time for a small joke. There is a well-known former Israeli prime minister called Levi Eshkol, and in the 60s we had a recession, and the Minister of Finance came to him desperate and told him that the unions want to switch to a 5-day work week. And his reply, famous reply, was, let's first see them work 1 day a week. So before we build the public key encryption, let's first maybe build the one-way functions. So LLW, Lavigne, Lincoln, and Williams give a candidate one-way functions based on the planted version of this 0K click. And I just want to point out a very nice abstraction that they have. They define what it means to succeed to invert the function with insignificant probability. This is a scaled down version of negligible. Very nice abstraction. I refer you to the paper to read it. We have tried desperately and vigorously tried to build one-way functions from our average case problems. We haven't succeeded. I refer you to the paper to see why not. We've tried to sample instances along with solutions in time that is linear instead of quadratic. And this would have given one-way functions automatically. We haven't succeeded. We've tried to give unconditional fine-grained zero-knowledge proof systems for these average case problems and invoke results by Ostrovsky and Vigdazon that give one-way functions for average case problem that have zero-knowledge problem. We haven't succeeded. And now, recently, given the BBB result that I mentioned in the previous slide, maybe there's hope to show that planted average case hard problems, which are known to yield one-way functions, could have worst case to average case reductions, and that could be an interesting direction to look at. Other foundational questions to look at are the questions asked by Moni in 2003 and possibly before. What's going on with hardness versus randomness in the fine-grained world? If you have a fine-grained one-way function, can you get a fine-grained PRG, PRF? What's the complexity of these reductions? These are problems that all need to be revisited in this context. Hardcore bits is an interesting question. LLW visited this question in their context. Hardness amplification, again, one has to be very careful with the bookkeeping, and there could be very interesting questions to be asked there. Okay, towards the end of the presentation, I want to give to wrap things up, and I'd like to give us some context. So what did we have? So we have this wonderful era, we still have it, of wonderful creatures that might eventually get extinct. And what we want is we want in such a case to have some descendant, some scaled down version of these creatures that is resilient after the big extinction event. Let's say a chicken, which is the closest known relative to a Tyrannosaurus rex, apparently. And what I want to point out is that not only that this chicken will be relevant if we don't live in cryptomania, borrowing Pagliazzo's names of the world where you have public key encryption. So not only the chicken will be interesting if we don't live in cryptomania, but live in minicrypt, where we have one-way functions, but don't have public key encryption, but we also be interesting in Pestilent, where we don't have one-way functions even, and only hardness on the average. And even if we don't have hardness on the average, and we're in heuristica, where P is not equal to NP, and yet we cannot get anything interesting on the average. So it means that we live in algorithmica, where P equals NP. Even then, we might get something interesting. Okay, so in any one of these worlds, we could get an interesting result, and I think this is enough motivation to work on these kind of problems. So maybe a more appropriate creature is a cockroach rather than a chicken, because it can survive all of these catastrophes and still prevail. Okay, actually, we do not believe that we live in algorithmica. Most of us believe that symmetric key encryption is super secure and takes exponential time. I would call it minicrypt on steroids. It means that there exist one-way functions with exponential hardness. Obviously, if we live in minicrypt on steroids, it's not so interesting to build things in poor man's Pestilent, where you have a fixed polynomial hardness of average case problems, because you get it automatically. So essentially what we've been showing, assuming we live in minicrypt on steroids, is not very interesting. The dream would be to push these results to poor man's cryptomania. This is where we have a fixed polynomial hardness of public key encryption. What we did show, and we did sort of see, is that if set, the strong exponential time hypothesis holds, I see that I'm over time, but Yuval is forgiving me, then you get proofs of work. We know that if minicrypt on steroids is true, if we live in minicrypt on steroids, we get a weaker hypothesis. An interesting open question is to get to poor man's Pestilent from ETH. A more interesting problem is to bounce these results and the structure using them to get to poor man's cryptomania. And maybe along the way, we'll have to crash via poor man's minicrypt, where we have fine-grained one-way functions. On an optimistic note, a joke from the Soviet Union. It's been asked back then behind the Iron Curtain, when will life be better in the Soviet Union? And the reply was, in the Soviet Union, life has already been better. That was the answer, and I cannot think of a more appropriate joke for this time that we live in. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. And we're actually a bit behind schedule. We have the contact tracing panel coming up. So maybe just a very quick question. We'll take other questions offline. Benny asks, how do your results that are based on exponential worst case hardness of SAT compare to what you could get from a seemingly incomparable assumption like average case hardness of random SAT, say n to the fifth hardness of random SAT under the uniform distribution?
I don't have an answer off the top of my head.
Okay, so we can take this offline.
Yeah, I want to encourage anybody who wants to ask me a question to get in touch with me either by email or by chat. This is what we would have done had we met face to face. Okay,
so on this happy note, thanks Alon for an inspiring talk. It was really a good combination of two invited talks of very different flavors. And we will resume the contact tracing panel. We will take a break now and we'll start the contact tracing panel 5 minutes late.
I apologize for the delay.
No problem. It was a long introduction also. So please join us in 15 minutes. Thanks a lot, Alon, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, everybody.